Okay, well, welcome. This is another session, part of the Utah State Historical Society's 68th Annual History Conference, virtual sessions throughout the month of September. And today we have a terrific set of speakers who will be introduced here in a moment. I just wanted to remind everyone tuning in to check out our website at history.utah.gov or ushs.utah.gov for more information about the conference and the various sessions that we've organized. In particular, on September 25th, a couple of live stream sessions. One, our keynote speaker, Dr. Lisa Tetrault, speaking about myth, memory, and the vote. And then our plenary panel will be on Native American voting rights. So please tune into that if you have a chance to do so. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brad Westwood, and who will introduce our two speakers and the session for today.
Chad, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Our two speakers, let me give you a bio, and then as you can see on the screen, here are their presentations. Derek Sainsbury holds a PhD in American history and is an author of Storming the Nation, the Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries. He teaches in the Ancient Scripture Department at Brigham Young University. He and his wife, Meredith, live in Bountiful, Utah, and they have 3 sons. Our second speaker for this session is Rebecca Wiederhold, who works in the technical service as a technical service archivist at Brigham Young University Harold B. Lee Library. She has a master's degree in library science with a specialization in digital content management from the University of North Texas. Her research interests include archival description, authority control, Mormonism, and local history here in Utah. As mentioned on the screen, Derek will be speaking first, and so Derek, please, your presentation.
Okay.
I should say, though, as we begin, that we'll have a little bit of a question and answer after, and so looking forward to interacting with both of these presenters. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you. What does it all mean? Wrote 80-year-old Latter-day Saint widow Nancy Naomi Alexander Tracy. 1896 Ogden, Utah was celebrating statehood, but she felt only sorrow. Now, where is Zion? She poignantly penned. For 62 years, she had sacrificed everything to build a Zion that now lay in ruins. Although the women of Utah had won back the suffrage that their leaders had given them and the federal government had taken away, for Nancy, the cost seemed too high. We know the struggle for suffrage in Utah was nested within the national Mormon question regarding polygamy and theocracy, but that was in turn nested within the Latter-day Saints' quest to build a Zion society. Nancy Tracy's life and words illustrate the rise and fall of this Zion and its protective theodemocracy. As the only female electioneer of Joseph Smith's 1844 presidential campaign, she is a fresh and female articulation to dramatize this meta-narrative usually expressed with a male and institutional voice. A narrative arc that begins with the Zion quest, how that led to the political philosophy of Aristarchic theodemocracy, how Smith's assassination transferred that philosophy into the Zion settlements of Utah, and only to be crushed by the federal government a half-century later. The central cause of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 19th century was establishing Zion. New Scripture defines Zion as a society whose inhabitants are one in mind, a political governing component, one in heart, a social component, dwell in righteousness, a religious spiritual component, and there are no poor among them, an economic component. Joseph Smith's revelations required converts to gather, build a temple city, and therein make covenants with God, committing to build Zion individually and collectively to prepare for Christ's millennial return and reign. As Smith's missionaries preached Zion, converts gathered to Latter-day Saint communities in Ohio and Missouri. Nancy Naomi Alexander was born in 1816 in New York. At 16, she married 22-year-old Moses Tracy. 2 years later, they converted and resettled in Kirtland, Ohio, dedicating all they had to the Zion effort. However, the holistic lifestyle of Zion created religious, political, social, and economic conflict with its neighbors. Latter-day Saints were forced to flee first Jackson County, Missouri, and later Kirtland, before rallying again in northern Missouri. In between, the Tracys decided to move to Missouri. Thus far, they had experienced, quote, peace and happiness, and received many rich blessings in connection with the saints, end quote. Missouri would change that. After a year just struggling to subsist, the Tracys built a home in Far West, Zion's new headquarters. Again, conflict emerged. Nancy gave birth to their third child just as the Mormon War exploded. The governor issued an extermination order that led to the surrender and imprisonment of Joseph Smith and the capture and exploitation of Far West. Moses, who had participated in its central battle, was in hiding. Her home under guard, Nancy lay critically ill with only her 3 young sons. She saw and heard fellow saints endure destruction and confiscation of their property, manhunts, rape, and even murder. A neighbor eventually evacuated the young family, who rendezvoused with Moses and the other refugees headed to Illinois. There, they built a city they named Nauvoo. The Tracys began their third iteration of Zion in a small, rude log hut where malaria took their youngest son. Yet, in 3 years' time, they lived comfortably in a home overlooking the temple site. Meanwhile, Joseph Smith formulated a political philosophy for Zion built from his people's persecution, former revelations, and new inspiration. It was a worldview of divine governance as the inheritance of the saints and the United States, centering on 2 ideas, aristarchy in leadership and theodemocracy in form. Aristarchy, or government by good or excellent men, aligned with Smith's revelation to promote and vote for good, honest, and wise men. Theodemocracy, which Smith defined as when, quote, God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness for the benefit of all, end quote, expressed God's sovereignty through his chosen aristarchic leaders, whom the populace willingly supported. Smith introduced these ideas in the Female Relief Society, local government elections, his presidential campaign, and the Council of 50. He began with Nauvoo's women in forming the Relief Society. By revelation, he declared his wife, Emma, as president. She nominated other officers, and the members voted to support them, creating an aristarchic, quote, living constitution, end quote. Members relieved the temporal and religious needs of fellow women and others within the wider community. Nancy was invited to join the society and reveled in the political and social space it gave her to participate more directly in Zion. Months later, at the temple site, Nancy watched Smith nominate men for city and local political office. Later, obedient saints would vote them in. What Smith and his followers saw as aristarchic theodemocracy protecting God's Zion, outsiders viewed as threatening theocracy. As conflict surfaced again, Smith wrote to the candidates in the upcoming 1844 presidential election for help. When none offered assistance, church leaders instead nominated Smith. He promptly dictated and distributed a political pamphlet. On March 11, 1844, he created another aristarchic theodemocratic living constitution, the Confidential Council of 50. Believing they were the literal kingdom of God on earth that would endure into Christ's millennial reign, the council orchestrated Smith's campaign and made plans to move Zion outside the nation's borders if he lost. Church leaders asked for men to serve electioneering missions, to canvass the nation, preaching Zion and politicking for Smith, using and distributing his pamphlet. The church's apostles would direct the campaign, attending conferences of electioneers throughout the nation. Initially, 277 men volunteered. However, I have discovered in my research that at its height, over 600 men served, the largest missionary force Smith ever assembled. Moses Tracy volunteered and was assigned to return to New York. Nancy wanted to go along so that the children could meet their grandparents. It seemed quite an undertaking, she admitted, but I felt equal to the task. She convinced Moses to ask Joseph Smith for permission. Smith concurred, saying Nancy would assist him well on his mission. The Tracys rented out their house and left, armed with copies of the Book of Mormon, Smith's pamphlet, and 4 sons under 11. It took 3 weeks to travel to Jefferson County, New York. As other electioneers were doing, they likely preached and politicked along the way. Both their families were happy to see the children, but cold to the message of Zion. Moses and Nancy together advocated Smith's candidacy as the best chance to save the nation, but heard only rejection as well for the campaign. Meanwhile, Mormon dissenters partnered with political enemies of Smith to assassinate him. When the Tracys learned 3 weeks later, they were horror-stricken. Moses sat sobbing out loud. Is it true? Can it be true? When so short a time ago, he set us apart to fill this mission and was all right? Eventually recovering, they finished their mission, returning to Nauvoo the following spring. Sadly, their 1-year-old fell ill along the way, dying soon after their return. Nancy and the Latter-day Saints saw Smith's murder as a rejection of both religious and political salvation. Subsequently driven from the nation, they decided that the United States government was irredeemably corrupt. The Tracys left Nauvoo, suffering greatly traversing Iowa, losing their second oldest son to sudden illness. Nancy had now lost 3 of their 6 children, each in the wake of expulsion. Even writing a half-century later, Nancy's anger towards the nation was stinging. Smith's murder was, quote, concocted from the official head down to the lowest demons that committed the dark deed. And this in our boasted land of liberty that our fathers fought and bled to redeem, to worship God as they chose. But where now is protection from mob violence? May the Lord have mercy on our enemies' souls for their cruelty and wickedness to an innocent and law-abiding people, end quote. In their minds, Nancy and her comrades were the true Americans who would save the founding ideals by creating them anew in the wilderness. The Joseph Smith Theodemocratic dream would be built instead in the West under Brigham Young. Arriving in Salt Lake Valley in 1850, the Tracys entered the state of Deseret, the aristarchic theodemocracy of Smith's Nauvoo writ large on the Great Basin. Church leaders were nominated to serve in corresponding political offices, and the population assented by voting them in. Thus, Church President Brigham Young was also governor, the apostles served in the territorial council, the different settlements' bishops were also mayors, and so on. Not surprisingly, leaders chose former electioneers for these dual roles well beyond their representation in the general male population. They had sacrificed to preach and electioneer for theodemocracy alongside the apostles and experienced with them the shared trauma of Smith's assassination while campaigning for him. They were a ready-made cadre of theodemocratic foot soldiers who became its religious and political field officers. The Tracys settled in Ogden, rejoicing to worship according to their conscience. True to the electioneer theodemocratic relationship, leaders assigned Moses to the religious high council of Weber County and subsequently in county government roles. But what of Nancy? Theodemocracy still inherited America's diminutive political sphere for females. While her cherished theodemocratic Zion brought her happiness and freedom to worship, it still restricted her politically, at least for now. In time, non-Mormon federal officials and settlers became uncomfortable with Utah's combination of church and state. In 1857, President James Buchanan sent a military expedition to quell the rumored rebellion. Brigham Young declared martial law and ordered those in northern Utah to escape to Utah Valley. For the Tracys, this latest exodus would again be tragic as Moses began having strokes. Fading, his dying wish was to see their homestead in Ogden again. When the word came to return, Nancy pushed her family forward. Ironically, they arrived home from their fourth government-induced exodus on Independence Day, 1858. Moses died just a few weeks later. In their 28 years of marriage, the Tracys had been driven from place to place, each time leading to a death in the family. Nancy was, quote, completely worn down with toil and hardships, of which my whole life had been made up after embracing the gospel. But I felt that my religion was more to me than all the world, and I felt determined to live it, end quote. So she persisted. Her farm bordered that of her husband's brother, 30-year-old Silas, who already had 2 wives. 44-year-old Nancy reminded him of the biblical requirement to marry his brother's widow. Thus, Nancy entered polygamy in 1860 and had another daughter in 1861. The arrangement worked out well until 1881, when Silas too passed away. Concurrently, the Transcontinental Railroad's approach threatened to bring more outsiders and their culture. One way Brigham Young sought to deflect that influence was by organizing the women into relief societies. Young asked the veterans of the Nauvoo Relief Society to recreate the organization in every congregation. They chose Nancy to help lead hers, a role she continued until her death. We labored energetically, she recalled, being helpers to the priesthood in all we could, in every way. She relished the political and social space the renewed Relief Society gave her. Particularly, she enjoyed working with old comrades from the Nauvoo Relief Society and hearing Theodemocratically Zion-tinged messages, such as one from Eliza Snow, quote, sisters, our position as saints of the Most High is at the head of the world, end quote. When the World's Railroad finally arrived, it literally split Nancy's and Silas's property, but its influence failed to split Utah's Theo from its democracy. In East Coast circles, some considered giving the suffrage to Latter-day Saint women, assuming they would vote out theocracy and polygamy. Their numbers would add to disaffected Latter-day Saints and others who had formed the Liberal Party to challenge Theodemocratic nominations. The idea backfired. The territorial legislature gave women the right to vote in 1870, and Latter-day Saint women voted for the church candidates, further entrenching theodemocracy. The federal government's response was stricter anti-polygamy legislation, including disenfranchising women. However, having exercised the vote, Latter-day Saint women fought to keep it. Relief societies were ready-made hives of political organizing. They gathered in large numbers throughout the territory and even in Washington, D.C. to protest, while church candidates continued to win elections. However, the passage of the Edmunds-Tucker Act disenfranchised not only women, but also polygamous men. In 1889, the Liberal Party won Nancy's beloved Ogden, and then in Salt Lake City the following year. Theodemocracy's back was broken. Leaders announced in 1890 that the church would no longer practice polygamy. However, it was not enough. The only way for self-rule to return was statehood in exchange for the church's political unity. In 1891, church leaders encouraged members to join either the Republican or Democratic parties. Thus, when Utah gained statehood in 1896, political unity and polygamy were gone, and so was Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's Theodemocratic Zion. That same year, Nancy Tracy wrote her last reminiscence. Sadly, she addressed little after her marriage to Silas in 1861. We do not know exactly how she viewed the suffrage movement or how actively she participated in it. However, she did have plenty to say about Zion and the religious and political rights of the Latter-day Saints. She noted the irony of outsiders having settled in Utah and established their churches without persecution, a privilege she and her peers had not enjoyed. Even now, 50 years later, they had not been allowed the constitutional liberty of conscience to worship as they pleased. Yet even more painful to Nancy was church members splitting into Republicans and Democrats, creating division and strife in a political realm that had only known Zion's unity for half a century? What good was winning the vote if she could not vote theodemocratically? Joseph Smith's campaign phrase, unity is power, that she and Moses had used electioneering and had lived under in Utah, came echoing back to her. We are told to be united, she penned, for in union is strength. Previous persecutions had united the saints. This adversity, however, was causing division, particularly intergenerationally. The younger generation seemed to care more about dressing, acting, and voting like the rest of America than building Zion. What was happening was confusing, even apostate, to Nancy and her surviving peers. They had given everything to the cause, blossomed Deseret out of the desert, and now saw it wilting away. What does it all mean? She wondered. Maybe it was the prophesied time that Zion would save the Constitution. Or perhaps all the confusion was portent of Christ's imminent return as King of Kings to set up his own government. Then all the current strife and contention would vanish, and the saints would once again, quote, with one accord, vote the same ticket, end quote. Her beliefs gave her, quote, consolation and satisfaction to know that we shall eventually become the head and not the tail. This is worth living for, and, if needs be, to die for, end quote. She had indeed lived for it and knew she was inching closer to death. Anxious to ensure that her grandchildren stayed true, she clung to life, praying to be preserved, that, quote, I might perchance be instrumental in helping them along. This was personal for her. Quote, I mourn when I see them go astray and grow indifferent to the things that should lay nearest of all to their hearts, end quote. Nancy would outlive Theodemocratic Zion for only 6 years, by only 6 years, fittingly passing away on March 11th, 1902, the 58th anniversary of the Council of 50. Interestingly and aptly, her only written thoughts of life after death centered on her fellow female friends who had already passed. They had fought a good fight, kept the faith, and have gone from this earth to a higher and nobler sphere of action, Joseph Smith's only female electioneer penned. When my time comes, I hope to enjoy the society of these noble women and labor with them on the other side, as I have done so upon this earth. Nancy, Naomi, Alexander, Tracy would fight on. Thank you.
Those familiar with the general history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints may know about the role of the Missionary Training Center, or MTC, in the training of missionaries, or its precursor, the language training mission of the 60s and 70s, or even the Salt Lake Mission Home, which provided coordinated missionary training for the better part of the past century. However, most people are unaware of the very beginning efforts of the church to provide basic gospel education for the young representatives it was sending throughout the world to preach and bring new members into the church. This building on BYU campus was paid for by contributions from church members in the Alpine, Nebo, Provo, and Wasatch congregations, and was dedicated in 1904. It was called the Missionary and Preparatory Building, and its very existence as a dedicated educational hall evidences the importance that was placed on this program back then, which few know very much about even today. My presentation provides a sneak peek into this period of LDS church history when the church began using its various academies to provide basic education for prospective missionaries. In terms of education, the United States experienced significant expansion during the latter half of the 19th century. A shift in focus could be seen from education primarily of the elite class to more widespread access due to the common school movement, creating an expectation for the education of young people in general. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints valued education, and by the turn of the 20th century, the church was sponsoring academies that offered secondary education and some college courses in over 30 locations, mostly throughout Utah, but also in Idaho, Wyoming, Arizona, Canada, and Mexico. Most of these academies were fairly short-lived and were closed down or in the process of being transferred to the local government by 1922 due to the establishment of public high schools in Utah, although a handful persisted in the church educational system. In 1875, the first academy established by the church was Brigham Young Academy, now BYU. By 1883, the school's principal, Carl G. Mazer, had instituted missionary meetings. These weekly meetings served the purpose of exposing young members of the church to practices and doctrines that they would need to be familiar with for future missionary service. At the close of other classes and meetings, Mazer made a point to invite all students to attend missionary meeting, although it was not compulsory. Held in the Academy's assembly hall on each Sunday when school was in session, the meetings consisted of a fairly regular program, similar to today's LDS church sacrament meetings. Presided over by Principal Mazer or other faculty, the meeting began with hymn singing and prayer. Prior to the preparation and administration of the sacrament, however, someone would give prepared remarks on the importance of the sacrament ordinance. The main meeting usually consisted of an address by a faculty member or general authority of the church on general church doctrine topics. This was always followed by an invitation for testimony bearing by the students, providing them ample opportunity to practice speaking about the gospel. Letters from currently serving missionaries were also often read to the congregation, and sometimes priesthood ordinations were performed. The meetings closed with assignments for the next week's meeting, hymn singing, and a benediction. Other church academies also held missionary meetings patterned after Brigham Young Academies program. The growing prevalence of access to education had a direct impact on missionary work. The church had begun sending missionaries to teach around the world as early as 1830. These early efforts were fruitful in spreading the church's message and bringing new converts to its membership. Church members from all walks of life were willing to answer the missionary call. And for a period, some of the most successful missionaries were, quote, men who could scarcely read or write, end quote. However, toward the end of the 19th century, as the American and European educational landscape progressed, the church began to recognize that proselyting elders who, quote, were taken from the plow, the anvil, the shoemaker's shop, and carpenter's bench would need general education in order to keep pace with the rest of the world, end quote. In the 1890s, the first presidency of the church and Mazer's successor at Brigham Young Academy, Principal Benjamin Clough, received correspondence from mission presidents, educators, and others, suggesting that young missionaries from rural areas without much formal education might have the zeal and testimony necessary to promote the gospel, but would greatly benefit from an organized missionary course that could be provided through the academies. A letter sent by President Wilford Woodruff and his counselors to the Council of Apostles expounded, quote, it is known to all of us who have had experience in the missionary field that there are very many, in fact, a great proportion of those who go out who do not do justice to the message of which they are bearers, and do not display that knowledge of the truth and of the character of the great work of the last days that one would naturally expect them to possess in view of their high calling and of the exalted origin of the priesthood which they bear. It is very desirable that something be done, if possible, to make a better impression upon the world through the medium of our elders, end quote. The letter closes with an admonition to adopt a training program for the elders that would guard against following a sectarian pattern, warning that the church must develop training that would be, quote, entirely free from any tendency likely to check the Spirit of the Lord or cause men to depend upon their own learning instead of the guidance of the Holy Ghost, end quote. To address this emerging need, by 1899, Principal Clough was prepared to offer a training program developed at Brigham Young Academy to prepare church members for missionary service through general education and courses on church doctrine. With the church's support, the first missionary course was offered on a probationary basis during the next academic year. Many of the other church academies began offering these classes as well. The missionary course's trial year was a success, and permission was extended to continue offering the program. For most who eventually attended the missionary course at a church academy, the bishop of the local congregation would ascertain whether or not a particular young man or young woman would benefit from additional education prior to serving a mission. The bishop would then submit these names to the first presidency for consideration. If approved, they would receive a formal call to attend the missionary course, which explained the purpose of the training and indicated to which academy they should present themselves if they decided to accept the call. A return letter was requested to notify of their acceptance. One Howard Spencer Jr. wrote in response to a call to Murdoch Academy in Beaver, Utah in 1910, quote, I will accept the call. I need the schooling very bad, and I will do the best I can at the missionary work, end quote. This was typical of the reply for most who accepted, often expressing humility and gratitude for the opportunity to gain more knowledge and experience before being sent out to preach. The missionary course at Brigham Young Academy and many of the other locations was generally expected to be taken over 2 semesters. Topics covered included church history, studies from the Bible and the Book of Mormon, principles of the gospel, singing, and instructions in grammar, reading, spelling, penmanship, oration, and even foreign languages, depending on the needs of individual students. A course of lectures by eminent men such as church apostles, returned missionaries, and others was also offered to teach about the needs of missionaries in the field of labor. A key component of the program was its commitment to offering these classes tuition-free, although students were responsible for their own room and board. One important text used in the missionary course was the Articles of Faith by scientist and Professor James E. Talmage. Students were also often encouraged to read additional books in their own time, depending upon their particular needs. Beginning in 1900, the Improvement Era magazine began printing a series of articles on the training and equipment of missionaries, which was recommended to, quote, serve as unequaled supplemental reading for young men taking the missionary course in church, academies, and colleges, end quote. By 1903, the First Presidency had sent a letter to bishops and stake presidents clarifying the expectation that missionary classes in church schools should only be recommended for those who are mentally and physically sound, who have the financial means to support themselves, and, quote, who have given some evidence of the workings of the Spirit of the Lord in their own souls, end quote. Leaders were also instructed that missionary course participants were not at liberty to leave the school at their pleasure and should only leave the academy upon an honorable release. One general academy class, which missionary students often took, was Professor Nels L. Nelson's oration or elocution class. The course of education at the church academies was expected to prepare young members of the church for lifelong service in a variety of callings and leadership positions. For missionaries in particular, there was certainly need for training in public speaking. Professor Nelson felt that raw missionaries were particularly prone to falling into the trap of relying solely on the Spirit to, quote, put sermons ready-made into their mouths, end quote. Professor Nelson saw that elders' poor preparation resulted in less success in the missionary work. The textbook he wrote, titled Preaching and Public Speaking, focused on cultivating mental capacity and the intentional improvement of prepared sermons. One student recalled a strong rebuke during a missionary elocution class. Quote, young man, take that hot mush out of your mouth and read so I can understand you, end quote. Professor Nelson acknowledged his habit of putting things strongly, although he intended no offense, hoping to only inspire improvement. The missionary course at most of the academies included a singing class. A 1905 newspaper advertisement for the missionary course at LDS University, now LDS Business College in Salt Lake City, described the purpose for including this class in the program. Quote, one of the greatest aids to missionary work is the singing of the hymns and songs of Zion. It always forms an attraction to listeners and prepares souls to receive the words of life and salvation. Persons who attend the missionary class can have the benefits of a musical training from Professor Evan Stevens, who takes such interest in the advancement of our young people and of the cause of truth that he stands ready to afford the aid which his experience and talent can furnish to equip our young men in this respect for the work of the mission field. This should be further inducement to attend this missionary class, and it should be valued at its exceeding great worth. Hurry up, young men, join the class, be diligent in study, and prepare yourselves for the work that lies before you, end quote. Professor Stevens was a well-known composer of LDS hymns and conductor of the Tabernacle Choir. In compiling and arranging the hymn book used in the class, Stevens included only well-known hymns, each of which he said had been inserted, quote, at the request of at least 2 different presidents of missions who have named them as being the most useful, end quote. As a professor who loved teaching music and was dedicated to supporting missionary work, Stevens often donated cash to his missionary choir members, sometimes substantial sums. As illustrated by the descriptions of the two courses I've already mentioned, professors were interested not only in educating their students' minds, but also in cultivating their character. Though serving as president of BYU, George H. Brimhall was not above stopping for a personal conversation with an individual student on campus. He also wrote to at least one potential student personally in an attempt to encourage him to take advantage of the education that the college classes of the missionary course could provide him, including preparation for future employment in addition to missionary service. While teaching one of the first missionary classes in 1901, Brimhall noted that a large percentage of the students were using tobacco, visiting saloons, and using foul language, and were generally lacking in ambition. By the end of the course, however, Brimhall was able to report that all 101 missionary course students were keeping the word of wisdom, had gained respect for the priesthood, and had developed an appreciation for learning and a desire to serve their fellow man. Turning from the discussion of the course's curriculum, I want to spend a few minutes providing a picture of the student experience. This is a portrait of 5 students who participated in the missionary course during its second year. In the bottom right corner is Moroni MacArthur. He was a farmer and contract worker from St. George, Utah. His father, Daniel Duncan MacArthur, had been a handcart company captain and helped to settle St. George, serving as state president there. Moroni was called at the age of 24 to serve in the Southern States Mission. Before he was to embark, he received a call from the First Presidency to take the missionary course at Brigham Young Academy. I first became aware of this early missionary training program through reading Moroni's mission journals, as he's my great-grandfather. In a 30-page diary, Moroni described his time at the Academy in daily entries from November 1901 through February 1902, detailing his study and the classes he attended. He also described attending lectures from general authorities or prominent church leaders such as B.H. Roberts and President George H. Brimhall, enjoying musical concerts, writing and receiving letters from home, shopping, and visiting with extended family members and friends, often playing checkers or singing until late into the night. He mentions both watching and playing baseball games with other members of the missionary class, leaving campus to spend time with family in Pleasant Grove, and even attending a dance with a young woman. Unfortunately, Moroni's diary is the only personal account from a missionary course student that I've been able to find so far, aside from a few extremely brief mentions in traditional missionary journals. I suspect that the practice of journal keeping was not common among the population of less educated members who were called upon to take the missionary course than among those more educated individuals who were called directly into missionary service. There is periodic mention of the missionary student experience in student newspapers, however, which is where I found this delightful drawing accompanying the description of an interesting event. At Rick's Academy in Rexburg, Idaho, there were at least 2 occurrences of missionary auctions, occurring in the fall of 1912 and again in 1913. Members of the missionary class typically joined a student body that were well acquainted with one another, having attended multiple years of high school together. In order to help integrate the missionaries who would only be at the school for 1 school year, and also to help promote the class, missionaries were auctioned off to the highest bidders at a social event, with winners admonished to take their prize to the party later that evening. It was reported that, quote, lady faculty members were the chief bidders of the sale, end quote. By the mid-19-teens, the presidency of BYU had begun writing letters to local bishoprics requesting referrals for young men who would be well served by attending the missionary courses. This recruitment effort may have been spurred by lighter than expected enrollments, which may perhaps be partially due to competition with the missionary correspondence school. While the missionary courses available at church academies certainly helped prepare many willing to serve missions, but who stood in need of doctrinal training and a bit of social polishing, there remained a subset of individuals who couldn't afford to do their studies away from the family, farm, and business responsibilities at home. In late 1911, the Church Board of General Education adopted a measure to establish a school of correspondence for a missionary course and the publishing of a manual for missionaries. President Joseph F. Smith soon sent a letter to bishoprics publicizing the correspondence school and requesting recommendations of names of ward members who could enroll. Having received reports from mission presidents that many of the approximately 2,000 missionaries in the field had not received a public school education, President Smith noted that they do not represent our people fairly, nor do they accomplish as much good as they would if they were better informed. Edwin S. Sheets was appointed to conduct the course. Scrupulously clean and strictly honest, Principal Sheets was a man especially qualified to administer the correspondence school, with significant experience both in missionary work and in the education profession. Students could enroll in the correspondence course at any time by writing to Principal Sheets and paying a one-time tuition fee of $10. There was no prescribed length of the course, as students could study at their own pace. The curriculum included texts written by well-known church leaders and writers. Primary topics of study included gospel principles and doctrines, church history, and a good text on English. Principal Sheets was painstakingly thorough in answering letters from his students and ran the program quite efficiently. By the end of its first year, participation in the correspondence school had spread to nearly all the Western states, as well as Mexico and Canada. Reports in December indicated that over 150 students were taking the course, and a handful of students had already completed their studies and entered their fields of labor in the northern states, eastern states, and African missions. Leaders of the church still desired that more prospective missionaries would take advantage of the correspondence course's convenient delivery of education. At the April 1913 General Conference of the Church, Joseph W. McMurrin of the First Council of 70 made an appeal to young men to enroll in the school in order to prepare themselves for the work of a mission, stating that he thought the class ought to have 1,000 members. Principal Sheets' family was unfortunately stricken with influenza during the 1918 pandemic. While caring for his wife and 2 children, Sheets also contracted the disease and succumbed to its grip in January 1919. Following his death, the correspondence school was apparently discontinued. As many of the church academies had closed or were being transferred to the state by the early 1920s, the missionary training program in schools was phased out. The burden of educating young members in church history and doctrine had shifted in the 19-teens and 1920s with the opening of seminaries and institutes of religion. Responsibility for training specific to missionary work was then transferred to the Salt Lake Mission Home, which was established at 31 North State Street in 1925. The new program was implemented under the supervisory committee helmed by Elder David O. McKay of the Council of the 12. Leroy C. Snow and his wife Burma presided over the home, a 2-story red brick building with a white porch. New missionaries arrived on Thursday of each week and were housed there for up to 2 weeks, while they participated in a rigorous program of instruction in missionary methods and benefited from association with church leaders and returned missionaries. The Salt Lake Mission Home remained in operation for several decades until 1978, eventually being supplemented and later superseded by other training programs implemented by the church. Formal missionary training returned to church school campuses in the 1960s to facilitate the needs of missionaries sent to foreign language missions, but the program that evolved into the missionary training centers, or MTCs, of today had roots in that early period of academy vision. As bluntly stated in an 1896 letter to Brigham Young Academy Principal Benjamin Clough by Elias S. Kimball, president of the Southern States Mission, quote, "It is true that some men will grow and thrive on dunghills, but they will grow and thrive better in colleges where the Spirit of God is and inspired men of God are appointed to teach."
Derek and Rebecca, thank you. Both wonderful presentations. In this COVID-19 era, it's remarkable that the presentations you offered were so well done and reflect so much deep research. I do have a couple of questions, and I hope that between the 4 of us we can interact together and that you don't necessarily feel like it has to be just me asking questions. I think both of you, both being from Brigham Young University, both in academic setting, you may very well have questions for each other, and I want to encourage that as well. Derek, first, related to your presentation, it piqued my interest when you said that you had discovered almost 600 missionaries. Of those 600, how many others brought spouses with them?
I found about 8 to 10 that took spouses, but none of them, there's no record, either journal or reminiscence or anywhere that shows any of those other wives preaching and electioneering like Naomi did.
So Naomi was the one that definitely was out front interacting with her husband. Do you see that as a kind of a peer experience with the other men? And was there any expression, or was there anything you researched that determined if that was the case? You know, kind of a peer.
She when she turned 16, she'd finished school, and the town actually asked her to be the new teacher. So she was very bright. She said that she was her family's favorite, which I think is kind of cute, and very outgoing. And Moses was a little bit the opposite. He was a little more introspective, courageous, but introspective. And so to me, it wouldn't be surprising to see her leading out like she does in so many other episodes of her life out on the mission. She wrote 4 or 5 different reminiscence accounts that cover the mission, and they all basically tell the same story, but they all do say that she is actually preaching, that she is actually sharing the political views of Joseph Smith. And then they were planning on going to her, after finishing with her husband's family, she was going to stay there, and Moses was going to start going throughout the county preaching. They were going to separate.
Mm-hmm.
But by that time, they had found that Joseph Smith had been killed. And interestingly enough, they had signed up for a 1-year mission. So they didn't return like a lot of other missionaries did. They stayed the full year into the next year. And he would proselyte away from town, and she continued to share the gospel in town with family and other friends and people, acquaintances. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No,
but
yes, thank you. It does. Was there any correlation, Derek, with 600 campaigners and those who were members of the Council of the 50?
That went out or after?
Well, I mean, were those who were campaigners also eventually in that other council? Was there any correlation between those two groups?
Yeah, there is correlation both going out with some of them, but in the people that are added to the council after, just like in other church and and political things doing with the church, these electioneers were very disproportionately used. So, for example, they comprise 15% of available priesthood. All 4 new apostles come from them. When the 85 high priests are selected in the 1844 October conference to go back out and establish stakes, which most of them never get around to doing because of the persecution, 55 of those 84 are these missionaries. And so there's no document or saying from any of the church authorities that, hey, we're giving you this because you went on this electioneering mission. But the idea of how consistently through their lives that they were chosen more than their peers, it's striking. I have the statistics and stuff in my book. It's very striking.
Wonderful. Derek, thank you. One last question.
Sure.
Is Nancy seen in any diaries, journals, or any interactions with any of the leading lights associated with the women's movement in Utah? I mean, you used a photo that shows the
Right.
the 1880 meeting amongst national
Right.
and local.
Right.
Like I wondered, I think you said she somehow hadn't been quite as actively involved, but I wondered if there was any connection.
Well, that's a great question. In her reminiscences, she doesn't speak much about anything after Silas's death until the 1896, until the present time when she's writing. I wanted to research a bunch of stuff in the Ogden Relief Society records and their General Relief Society records, but there was this thing called COVID, and the library people weren't very nice about letting me come in. So I'm not sure if there would be more in there, but she was, from her own experiences and other places I was able to find, she was very active in Ogden and was part of the leadership there. And she mentions people like Phoebe Woodruff, Eliza Snow, and others that she had worked with in Nauvoo.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sure there was some interaction. I just don't know what amount there was.
Derek, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Rebecca, I have 3 or 4 questions for you.
Sure.
How did the, at the same time, we have this flowering of corporate America, and the whole business experience grew out of the post-Civil War. Is there any interaction with business schools or corporations, or is there something that influences early? I'm fascinated with the intersection of business thinking and sales with missionary. Did you see any of that in your research?
I didn't run across anything like that, no.
Nothing about sales thinking that's going on in America? How to
No.
sell things?
Although like Derek, there were quite a few collections up at the church that I did want to go see this summer and have had to put that part on hold. So I'll have to look into that when I prepare this for a paper.
Do you think that the church was interested also in responding to new biblical criticism, or all the sort of seminary training that was going on with other religions? Did that have any impact on what the church wanted to do?
Probably. I mean, they were specifically targeting uneducated people who didn't have this understanding fully of even the Bible or the scriptures that they were talking about. And so to be able to communicate with other members of churches and sometimes ministries and things like that, they really needed to have at least a basic understanding of where to look and some books to read and in preparation for that.
Did class, when you were sent off to this class, Rebecca, did it just automatically go that you would be called to a mission? I mean, was there any correspondence between going to school?
The letters to the stake presidents and bishops said specifically, this does not mean that they will necessarily be called to a mission, but that it would help prepare them and make it more likely that they could go on a mission. So yeah, it was interesting that they would have a separate call. And in some instances, they received a call to the mission and wrote back and said, I sure would like an education first. And then they got a second call. Yeah.
Is there any records of wards paying for these students to go? I mean, you indicated
to go on their missions or to the course?
Or no, to go to their 2-semester course. Was there subsidy?
The subsidy, the tuition was free, and the travel to the course, these were in their stakes. These academies were in their stakes, and so it wasn't so much travel sometimes, although there was a St. George Academy, but my great-grandfather was from St. George, and he got called to the Provo BY Academy. So he requested train fare and received that from the church.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed hearing about music and it's as a powerful way of doing missionary work. It doesn't seem to be a priority these days. I think everyone wants to sing, but I don't remember seeing any courses offered.
Specifically missionary songs. You should take a look at that hymn book that was written for the missionaries.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating part of what you shared. And then the Edwin S. Sheets missionary correspondence portends to what we're now doing now.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting that it didn't get picked up by others, because this is the era of correspondence schools for,
right,
draftsmen and mechanics and engineers. And so I would have thought someone else would have picked that up. Well, both fascinating presentations. And do you two have any questions for each other before we turn it back over, or anything else you'd like to share?
I was curious to ask Derek, in terms of the material that you mined for all of this information about who did all these things. I mean, I haven't read your full book yet, though I checked it out of the library. how much of that is in like reminiscences, like you were referencing, or diaries? Did a large percentage of them keep a record of it?
Of the actual campaigning?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's about equal of diaries that are on hand to reminiscences, but as far as the overall number, it's less than 100
Okay.
that kept those. And there's also newspaper accounts and other people's journals. You know, a lot of the missionaries that I found were missionaries who were keeping journals during the campaign and mentioned these other men who were out there with them.
Oh yeah.
But otherwise, we wouldn't know that they were participating.
Right.
So, yeah, it's about an even split. But like I said, less than 100 actually that we have, or that I know of. And man, I spent a decade. So
I
if
bet.
there's
Yeah.
any
You
more
really
out there,
bug.
I'm sure there might be. I'm interested, Rebecca, with, in the late 30s at Brigham Young University, Reuben J. Clark came and kind of put the hammer down on professors who were not faithful, that were teaching worldly things, and invited them to resign if they didn't want to change their mind. Did you see any intersection there with that, with the
During
academies, where there were people who were worried about what was being taught in the academies?
That early, I didn't run across too much of that, but my research really was very focused on what was going on with the missionary course.
Right.
And I didn't run across correspondence or anything.
None of them got kicked out for being naughty?
Not that I know of.
Well, Rebecca, there was a lot of competition amongst the academies. We sometimes treat it as if it was a unified system.
Right.
Those schools were competing with each other, including for missionaries for those courses, were they not?
Yeah. But there was also a lot of effort to recruit missionaries to even come to the academies. So I don't know if it was just challenging to get people to come to the missionary course particularly. I don't know.
Okay. Well, Derek, Rebecca, thank you so much for being part of this. And Jed, are you there, my friend?
I am here. I'm listening very intently. I'll echo what Brad said. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Derek, for your presentations. Thank you, Brad, for fostering some conversation and asking your questions. So so I thank you for participating and taking the time to do this. And again, just a reminder to folks out there that we have a whole slate of presentations on our website at history.utah.gov. So tune in to the full program, and I hope you all enjoy this and the rest of the conference program. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.